There is something profoundly unsettling about silence. It is not merely the absence of sound, but a void that seems to yearn to be filled, an anxious echo. That was what Caroline felt as she stepped out of the car and faced the immense property before her. The house, with its Victorian structure, seemed to have emerged from the very ground, like an old wound that had never completely healed. The locals called it La Maison du Dernier Souffle, the house of the last breath. No one quite knew why the name persisted, but rumors spoke of bones buried beneath its foundations, of spirits wandering in the night, and of a weight that crushed the soul of anyone who resided there. Caroline did not believe in ghosts, or at least, that was what she told herself. The reason for Caroline's visit was simple. The house was for sale. After her divorce and her mother's recent death, she was seeking a fresh start. But that wasn't what the house offered. Upon opening the door, a peculiar smell enveloped her, something between old wood and damp earth. For a moment she felt as if she were stepping on a grave, but dismissed the thought as a product of fatigue. The entrance was oppressively dark, even with the windows open. The curtains swayed as if they had a mind of their own, moving irregularly, even though the air was still. And then it began. First came the sound, a low noise, almost indistinguishable, like a whisper coming from upstairs. Caroline froze, her eyes fixed on the spiral staircase that led to the upper floor. She was not alone. "It's an old house," she murmured to herself, trying to control the tremor in her voice. Old wood always creaks. But the sound continued. It wasn't the creaking of boards, but something alive. Words distorted by tongues that should not be able to speak. She tried to ignore it. She climbed the stairs with hesitant steps, the floor responding with pops that seemed amplified. At the top, a long, narrow hallway stretched out before her, flanked by closed doors. There was something wrong there, something she couldn't explain. That was when she noticed the first mark. On the wall to her right, there were deep scratches that descended toward the floor, as if someone, or something, had been dragged against the wall. A door at the end of the hallway slowly opened with a nearly human groan. Inside, there was only darkness. Caroline held her breath. "Don't be ridiculous," she told herself, trying to ignore the chill that crept up her spine. She took a step toward the dark room, and that was when she heard it. "Are you listening?" The voice was not hers. It did not come from inside the room. It came from nowhere she could identify. Caroline turned around, her heart racing. The hallway behind her looked different. It seemed longer, and the walls were covered in marks that hadn't been there before. "Are you listening?" The question was repeated, this time louder. She ran. Her footsteps echoed in all directions, as if the house were moving around her. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the door she had entered was closed. She tried to open it, but it was as if it were stuck. And then, silence returned. Behind her, the final whisper, "No one leaves." The first night in the house was marked by restless sleep. Caroline had decided to stay until dawn, more out of stubbornness than necessity. She wanted to prove to herself that her fears were unfounded, that all of this was a product of her imagination, or of the stress accumulated in recent months. She settled on the small sofa in the main room, wrapped in a blanket she had found in one of the kitchen drawers. The silence was thick, like a suffocating shroud. Around 3 in the morning, Caroline woke with a start. Not because she had heard something, but because the silence felt heavier than before. The air in the room seemed to have been drained. She sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, and noticed something strange. The shadows on the wall did not correspond to the furniture around. The shapes moved, stretching, twisting. They seemed to have a life of their own, escaping the boundaries of logic. She tried to turn on the light, but the switch did not respond. That was when she noticed. There was something in the reflection of the window, a figure standing behind her. She turned her head quickly, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, the motionless furniture, and that strange smell, stronger now, a mix of decay and damp earth. She decided she could not stay there. She would go upstairs to the bedroom, where at least she could close the door. As she climbed the stairs, each step seemed to groan beneath her feet. The shadows danced around her, but she refused to look directly at them. It was as if a primitive instinct told her not to acknowledge what she saw. When she entered the master bedroom, she locked the door. Leaning against it, she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps on the other side. Slowly they stopped, right in front of the door. "Caroline!" The voice was whispered, dragged out, as if it came from a throat full of dirt. She did not respond. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure she would be heard. And then the knocking began. It was not frantic, but rhythmic. 3 slow knocks, then silence. Caroline did not know how long it lasted. It could have been minutes or hours. When she finally opened her eyes, not realizing she had closed them, the morning sun was beginning to filter through the window. Silence had returned. She descended the stairs slowly, her body tense. The smell of decay seemed to have intensified. Upon reaching the living room, she realized something was different. On the floor, near the front door, there were footprints marked in the wood. They were small, almost childlike, and wet, as if something had come out of the depths of a well. Caroline tried to rationalize what she saw. Maybe it was just a structural issue, she thought. Old houses have their own secrets, but the secrets of this house were not the kind that could be fixed with tools. She decided to look into the property's history. She headed to the local library, where she spent hours researching the city archives. It was then that she discovered something that froze the blood in her veins. The house had been built over a cemetery. More than that, she uncovered old accounts of unexplained disappearances in the area, long before the construction. A local reverend had written a note at the end of the 19th century, warning of entities lurking in the soil, hungry for the souls of the living. When she returned home, she carried with her not only documents, but a weight that seemed to double her shoulders. And as soon as she stepped inside again, she felt the change immediately. The house was waiting for her. The whispers began again that night, louder and clearer. They were not just voices. They were laments, moans of something that seemed trapped between 2 worlds. And the shadows. Now they had eyes. At the back of the house, a metallic sound echoed, like a door that shouldn't exist being opened. And for the first time, Caroline realized she was being watched. Caroline began to notice that time in the house did not behave as it should. Days and nights seemed to merge, and the sunlight, when it reached her, was pale and devoid of warmth. Even when the clock struck noon, the shadows in the room remained long and restless. After the metallic sound that night, Caroline avoided the lower floor. Something told her that the heart of that house was hidden down there, beneath the floor where the forgotten cemetery lay. The documents she had found in the library revealed something even more disturbing. Among the bones buried beneath the house, there were those of children. An old orphanage had burned down on the site during the Civil War, and dozens of small bodies were never formally buried. Caroline began to hear the laughter, faint at first, almost indistinguishable, but always coming from the same place, the basement. They came mixed with whispers, as if several voices were speaking at once. One detail troubled her deeply. She had never found the basement door. The next night, while trying to sleep, something new happened. The bed began to shake, not violently but with a rhythmic motion, as if someone were gently pushing it back and forth. Caroline jumped up, her heart racing, and saw the marks. On the wooden floor next to the bed, there were small footprints, a line toward the bedroom door, but the door had never been opened. She knew that the only way to understand what was happening would be to face whatever was in the lower floor. With a flashlight in hand and her heart weighing like lead, she descended the stairs. The house felt alive around her. Every creak of the floor sounded like a breath, every shadow a pair of eyes. When she reached the first floor, the smell of decay enveloped her again, this time so strong that it made her stagger. And that was when she saw it. In the corner of the room, a piece of the carpet had been pulled aside, revealing something that shouldn't be there. An old wooden door with rusty hinges embedded directly in the ground. She knew that was the basement. Do not go down. The voice was clear and firm, coming directly from behind her. Caroline spun around quickly, but there was no one. Only the empty walls, the still shadows. But the warning did not stop her. She pulled the basement door, and the sound it made was like an agonizing scream. The air that came out was cold and heavy, as if it had been trapped for centuries. The flashlight trembled in her hands as it illuminated what lay below. The space was much larger than it should be. A dirt tunnel stretched far away, disappearing into darkness. The walls were marked with symbols that seemed etched with human nails. She hesitated but descended. Each step was a struggle against the instinct to flee. The tunnel seemed to pulse, as if it were a living vein, and the sound of children's laughter echoed in the distance, distorted, as if something were playing with her. Caroline found something at the end of the tunnel, a large room, with an altar in the center. On it, bones arranged in patterns that seemed to form a macabre symbol. There were candles around, but they burned with a strange bluish light that did not illuminate the room but made the shadows move erratically. And then she saw them, the children. They were standing around the altar, small pale figures with black expressionless eyes. Their faces were lifeless, but their bodies trembled as if they were puppets suspended by invisible strings. One of them approached. "You shouldn't be here." Caroline couldn't move. The ground seemed to hold her in place as the children slowly approached. Their voices echoed in unison, forming words that made no sense. And then the altar began to pulse. A figure began to emerge from the altar. It was not human. It was something impossible to describe. A mass of shadows and distorted shapes that seemed to change every second. The bones on the altar began to move, as if dancing to the rhythm of that grotesque apparition. Caroline screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the tunnel. She tried to run, but the children surrounded her. They grabbed her hands, her feet, and with a strength they shouldn't possess, began to pull her toward the altar. "You will be one of us," they said in unison, their voices resonating like a choir of suffering. In the last moment, Caroline managed to break free. She ran, stumbling, crying, as the thing on the altar grew, and the children chased her with quick, inhuman steps. When she reached the basement door, she climbed back into the room and slammed it shut. Silence returned, but not relief. The house seemed to mock her, as if it knew she would never escape. Caroline spent the night sitting on the couch, her body shaking and her mind disoriented. Outside, the darkness seemed alive, pressing against the windows as if it wanted to enter. She had locked the basement door with everything she could find, but she knew, deep down in her mind, that nothing would be enough. The clock read 3:45 in the morning when the silence was broken. At first the sound was faint, like something scraping on the floor. Then came the unmistakable creaking of the basement wood, as if something were climbing the stairs. Caroline looked at the door. It was closed, but the hinges began to tremble, making small metallic sounds that seemed to echo throughout the house. She stood up, her legs shaky, and began to back away. It was then that she heard the voice. "You opened the door." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It wasn't loud, but it resonated in her mind like a scream. Caroline ran upstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to hide in her room, but as soon as she locked the door, something began to bang against it. The wood seemed ready to give way with each impact, but what terrified her even more was the sound from the other side. Childish laughter mixed with something that sounded like claws scratching the surface. When the banging stopped, Caroline realized she was alone, or so she thought. She turned to the room and saw, for the first time, the extent of what she had unearthed. The walls of the room were covered with handprints, small and stained with something dark that looked like dried blood. On the floor, the same symbols she had seen in the tunnel glowed faintly, as if they were emitting their own light. And in the corner of the room, near the window, there was a figure. It was a woman, or at least something resembling a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were mere black holes that seemed to suck in light. She smiled, and the smile was too wide, a grotesque cut that crossed her face. "You saw what you shouldn't have," the figure said. "Now they will come for you." Caroline tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. The woman took a step forward, her body moving erratically, as if pulled by invisible strings. Without thinking, Caroline ran out of the room. The house seemed alive now, the hallways stretching and bending in impossible ways. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the sound of laughter echoed from all sides. When she reached the lower floor, she stopped abruptly. The basement door was open. From there, a bluish light pulsed, seeming to call her. She knew that somehow she had to go down again. There was no way to escape. The basement steps were cold, almost icy. The blue light grew stronger as she descended, and the sounds around her became clearer. Moans, muffled screams, and that dragging voice, saying things she couldn't understand. When she reached the bottom, the scene she found made her fall to her knees. The altar was different. The bones had rearranged into a grotesque shape, like a skeletal creature about to rise. Around it, the children were still there, but now their faces were no longer childlike. They had transformed into something monstrous, with mouths full of sharp teeth and completely black eyes. and in the center of the altar, the thing that had emerged before was now fully formed. It was a shapeless mass of flesh and shadow, pulsing as if it had a life of its own. From that thing came a sound that made the air vibrate, a kind of continuous murmur that seemed to be made up of thousands of voices. Caroline couldn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the creature, even as it began to crawl toward her. She tried to get up, but something held her feet. Looking down, she saw hands emerging from the ground, small and pale, pulling her down. "You are ours now," the children said, their voices united in a disturbing choir. Caroline screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the growing sound of the thing on the altar. The last thing she saw before being pulled completely into the darkness was the grotesque smile of the pale woman, watching from afar. When Caroline woke up, she was no longer in the basement. Or at least, it wasn't the basement as she knew it. The ground was made of black dirt, and the air felt heavy, as if she were breathing something that shouldn't exist. Around her, the children remained, but now they were motionless, their black eyes watching her with an intensity that seemed to pierce her soul. She tried to move, but her body didn't respond. It was then that she heard the voice again, deep, dragging, and laden with something far worse than hate. "You belong to us." From the altar, the shapeless mass that had once seemed like a pile of shadows had now taken on an almost human form. But something was wrong, very wrong. Its proportions were impossible. And the eyes, those eyes, were an abyss that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Caroline realized there was no escape. Everything she had felt since the moment she stepped into that house converged to this moment. She had been marked from the beginning, chosen for something she could never understand. And then, the thing spoke again. "This house is our prison, and now, you will be the key." Caroline screamed as the thing approached. The children began to move, their bodies trembling in grotesque spasms as they sang something in a language that shouldn't exist. The shadows closed in around her, and all she felt was pain. Not physical pain, but something much deeper, a break in her very essence, as if her soul were being torn apart and replaced by something ancient and unnameable. When the townspeople found the house days later, everything seemed normal, except for one detail. The basement door was sealed, as if it had never existed. Caroline had disappeared, and no sign of her was ever found. But the new residents began to report things. Laughter at night, small footsteps on the floor, and sometimes in the absolute silence the sound of a woman crying, begging to get out. Have you ever noticed how some houses seem alive, as if they silently watch every person who passes through their doors? Perhaps you are reading this in such a place. Maybe, right now, as you look around, you feel something different. A sudden chill, a noise coming from somewhere there shouldn't be anyone. Stories like Caroline's are not just legends. They are warnings. Places carry memories, and some memories do not want to be forgotten. If you felt uneasy with this account, it might be because, deep down, you know it's true. And if, while reading this, you notice that something has changed around you, a strange smell, a low whisper, a shadow in the corner of your eye, do not ignore it. After all, you know what they say. Old houses never stay empty for long. Now it's your turn. Have you ever been in a place that felt wrong? Have you ever felt as if you were being watched, even when alone? Share your experience in the comments. Who knows, maybe your story needs to be told too. And remember, not every nightmare ends when you wake up.